world where trust is sacred, there's perhaps no bond more profound than the one between a doctor and a patient. When we walk into a hospital, we place our lives in the hands of those wearing white coats. We believe in their knowledge, their training, and their promise to do no harm. But what happens when that trust becomes a weapon? What happens when the person meant to heal turns into the source of unimaginable pain? This isn't a fictional horror story. It's not a plot from a medical drama or a twisted thriller. This is real life, a terrifying chapter in the history of American medicine. Dr. Christopher Duntsch was once seen as the epitome of success. With a medical degree, a PhD in molecular biology, and a trail of glowing recommendations, he convinced patients and hospitals alike that he was one of the brightest minds in neurosurgery. But hidden behind the diplomas and surgical masks was a man whose recklessness, arrogance, and refusal to acknowledge his limitations left a trail of destruction. In less than 2 years, Duntsch operated on 38 patients in Dallas, Texas. Of those, 31 suffered catastrophic injuries, ranging from nerve damage to paralysis. 2 never made it off the operating table alive. These were mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters, people who trusted him with their lives and paid the ultimate price. His actions didn't just ruin lives. They challenged an entire system. How did someone so dangerous rise through the ranks? Why didn't anyone stop him sooner? And what drove him to continue cutting into people when it was clear his scalpel was a weapon of harm? This is the story of Dr. Christopher Duntsch, the man who would become known across America as Dr. Death. His name is now synonymous with betrayal, and his legacy is a chilling reminder that even in places of healing, evil can lurk. In Montana's serene, rugged landscape, where the mountains carve through an endless blue sky, Christopher Duntsch spent the first years of his life. Montana wasn't just a place. It was a way of life, quiet, demanding, and grounded in hard work. The people who lived there were often as tough as the terrain, shaped by the challenges of the land. For Duntsch, those early years represented a simpler time, but his family's move to Memphis, Tennessee, would mark the beginning of a new chapter. One filled with ambition, achievement, and eventually devastating failure. Duntsch's family settled into a close-knit community where faith and discipline were guiding principles. He was the eldest of 4 siblings, and from a young age, he seemed determined to set himself apart. His father, Donald Duntsch, was a physical therapist, while his mother, Susan, was a schoolteacher. Together, they instilled in their children the value of education and perseverance. It was a household where excellence wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. As a teenager, Duntsch attended Christian Brothers High School, a prestigious Catholic school in Memphis known for its rigorous academics and athletic programs. For Christopher, the school was more than just a place to study. When Duntsch enrolled at Millsaps College in Mississippi, he threw himself into his studies with the same intensity he had once reserved for football. His professors noted his focus and drive, but there were also murmurs of something else, a need to not just succeed, but to dominate. At the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, Christopher took on an ambitious dual-degree program, earning both an MD and a PhD in molecular biology. The workload was immense. Few could handle the pressure of mastering 2 demanding disciplines simultaneously. But for Duntsch, it was an opportunity to prove, once again, that he was not just ordinary. He wasn't just a doctor. He was a researcher, an innovator, someone destined to make history. His PhD research focused on regenerative medicine, a cutting-edge field with the potential to revolutionize healthcare. In the lab, Duntsch was known for his work ethic. He would stay for hours, running experiments long after others had left. But there was a darker side to his determination. Colleagues began to notice a troubling pattern. He was often overconfident, unwilling to accept feedback, and quick to deflect blame when things didn't go as planned. To some, these were the quirks of a perfectionist. To others, they were red flags. Despite these warning signs, Duntsch graduated with high praise. His resume sparkled, and his interviews with hospitals painted the picture of a brilliant, driven surgeon who was ready to change the world. No one could have imagined the chaos that would follow when this promising young doctor stepped into his first operating room. In the competitive world of neurosurgery, where precision and humility are essential, Christopher Duntsch's confidence was both his greatest asset and his greatest flaw. He believed in his abilities with an almost unshakable conviction, a trait that earned him admiration in interviews but skepticism from those who worked alongside him. And yet, none of this stopped him. In 2011, Christopher Duntsch moved to Dallas, Texas, to begin practicing as a neurosurgeon. With his credentials, he had no trouble finding work. Hospitals were eager to hire him, patients were eager to meet him, and Duntsch was eager to prove himself. But behind the polished exterior of the successful surgeon lay a disturbing truth. A truth that would soon come to light, leaving countless lives shattered in its wake. For Christopher Duntsch, the journey to becoming a neurosurgeon wasn't just a career. It was an identity. He had worked tirelessly to rise to the top, overcoming setbacks and silencing critics along the way. But what no one knew was that his relentless ambition was a double-edged sword. The same drive that had propelled him to success would soon lead to tragedy. As he stepped into the operating room for the first time in Dallas, he wasn't just a doctor with a scalpel. He was a man playing with lives. Christopher Duntsch's rise to neurosurgical prominence was swift, but his fall was equally quick and catastrophic. He had made a name for himself, not for groundbreaking surgeries or life-saving innovations, but for something far darker: failure. The surgeries that seemed like routine procedures for a seasoned neurosurgeon quickly turned into tragic, unexplainable disasters. As the operating room became his battleground, it was clear that this was no longer about healing. It was about something far more chilling. For every patient Dr. Duntsch operated on, the nightmare began the moment they regained consciousness. What should have been life-changing procedures turned into harrowing, often debilitating experiences. His first victim, known only as Patient A, was a healthy woman. She came in for a routine neck surgery, but when she awoke from anesthesia, was left with chronic pain after Duntsch operated on the wrong part of his back. Patient A later had a second operation by Duntsch to relieve it and was left paralyzed in his legs. She required months of rehabilitation to walk with a cane and was left unable to walk over 30 feet or stand for more than a few minutes. There were no explanations for what had happened, but it was clear. Something had gone horribly wrong. The story of Patient A wasn't isolated. More patients followed. One by one, Duntsch's surgeries grew more catastrophic. During a spinal procedure, the surgeon made several critical errors, including cutting an unnecessary ligament, misplacing spinal hardware, and improperly inserting a screw that posed a severe bleeding risk. The assisting surgeon intervened during the operation and later confronted the primary surgeon about the dangerous behavior. The patient was left with chronic pain and limited mobility as a result of the procedure. During a routine spinal surgery, the patient sustained significant injuries, including a severed spinal cord and artery. Despite clear indications of massive blood loss and warnings from a trauma surgeon and anesthesiologist, Duntsch proceeded with the operation without addressing the critical situation. After the surgery, the patient awoke in extreme distress, screaming and clawing at their legs. This required the ICU team to administer additional anesthesia to manage the situation. Duntsch, however, remained in the ICU waiting room writing notes instead of attending to the patient. The patient eventually suffered a hemorrhagic cardiac arrest and passed away due to uncontrolled bleeding. This case highlights severe lapses in judgment and protocol, emphasizing the necessity for immediate action in life-threatening scenarios during surgical procedures. Each of these surgeries had a common thread, a common perpetrator: Dr. Christopher Duntsch. What made Dr. Duntsch's actions even more unfathomable was his apparent confidence. He didn't just make mistakes. He ignored the signs, continued performing surgeries despite his errors, and even lied about them. Patient X, a mother of two, was operated on by Duntsch for a simple disc replacement. But when she woke up, her leg was completely numb. No one could explain why. She begged for answers. Duntsch simply brushed her off. He told her everything was fine, that the recovery would take time. But her condition only worsened. Within days, she was paralyzed. Yet, Duntsch remained unfazed. His arrogance seemed boundless. In interviews, he painted himself as a top-tier neurosurgeon, and in private, he continually made excuses for his errors. The hospital staff was beginning to raise concerns, but no one took it seriously at first. His credentials were too impressive, his charm too convincing. The bodies kept piling up, but it was as if no one wanted to believe that the doctor they trusted could be the cause of the carnage. But it wasn't just Duntsch's incompetence that made him dangerous. It was his refusal to stop. While his patients screamed for help, he continued on cutting, operating, refusing to acknowledge the mounting evidence that he was unfit to perform these surgeries. By the time the authorities began to take notice, the damage was irreversible. Dr. Duntsch's arrogance led to more than just broken bodies. It destroyed careers, families, and lives. But the deeper question remained: why did he keep going? Was he incompetent? Or was something more sinister at play? Was he driven by something darker? Something that couldn't be explained away by simple carelessness? The bodies were piling up. The lawsuits were mounting. Yet for a long time, Dr. Christopher Duntsch remained untouchable. His medical license remained intact, despite the mounting evidence of his incompetence, recklessness, and harm. But as the victims' families grew desperate, as the patients themselves began speaking out, the walls around Dr. Duntsch were finally starting to close in. The question was no longer if he would be stopped, but when. It started with whispers. The stories of botched surgeries, unexplained injuries, and devastating outcomes. They circulated quietly at first, dismissed as one-off errors. But the whispers soon turned to murmurs. Those murmurs grew into something far more alarming. A pattern. It wasn't just one patient. It wasn't even just a handful of patients. Dr. Duntsch's track record was beginning to look less like a series of isolated medical mistakes and more like a systemic failure of one man's competence. It was almost as if the more patients he operated on, the worse things got. The risk wasn't just high, it was catastrophic. Family members began talking to each other. Victims of his surgeries found one another, connected through shared experiences of physical pain and mental anguish. They began comparing notes, recounting their loved ones' last moments before surgery, how they went entrusting the hands of a highly regarded neurosurgeon, and how they came out broken. Some never to walk again, others left with pain that would never subside. But it wasn't only the patients and their families who were raising alarms. The medical community couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Dr. Kim Moore, a respected neurosurgeon and one of Duntsch's colleagues, was among the first to speak up. She had worked alongside him, seen his surgeries, and watched as his failures began to pile up. As early as 2012, Dr. Moore was noticing the unsettling pattern of mistakes. At first, she was reluctant to act. She knew how difficult it was to question a colleague, particularly one as charismatic as Dr. Duntsch. But as the stakes grew higher, she couldn't remain silent. Her decision to speak out was not easy. She knew the system would push back, that it would be difficult to stand alone against a doctor with so much promise and so many allies. But Dr. Moore was unwavering. She began reporting what she saw, documenting Duntsch's errors, and raising the alarm to higher authorities. Yet, the response was slow, painfully slow. By now, Dr. Duntsch had performed numerous surgeries, and the consequences were impossible to ignore. Patients were suffering debilitating injuries, with no clear explanation as to why. Some were left paralyzed, others in so much pain that they couldn't function normally. Duntsch, however, continued to operate with a disturbing confidence, seemingly oblivious to the mounting evidence against him. His arrogance in the operating room, his disregard for patient welfare, it all pointed to something far worse than simple incompetence. As the victims' families came together, they became more vocal. The public was beginning to take notice. News outlets started picking up on the pattern. The media began running stories about the botched surgeries and reckless doctor, The media coverage gave the victims a voice they so desperately needed, and their stories couldn't be ignored any longer. It wasn't just the press that started digging into Duntsch's past. Detectives and investigators began reviewing the cases with new eyes. They found reports of surgical complications going back months, maybe even years. And when they started talking to patients who had survived his surgeries, the horror stories became impossible to ignore. One patient described how, after a routine back surgery, they woke up to find that their spine had been severed, leaving them permanently disabled. Another spoke of severe internal bleeding, an event that could have been prevented had the surgery been performed properly. As the detectives began piecing together the puzzle, they discovered something even more disturbing. Dr. Duntsch had repeatedly lied about the outcomes of his surgeries. Each new patient's story was more damning than the last. One after another, the evidence began to stack up. And yet, Duntsch continued to practice medicine, seemingly untouched by the growing tidal wave of complaints against him. How had he managed to escape scrutiny for so long? How had a doctor with such a clear track record of failure been allowed to keep operating? The answer, as investigators soon discovered, was a combination of arrogance, privilege, and the failure of the medical system. Dr. Duntsch wasn't just another doctor. He was a highly educated neurosurgeon, someone with an impressive resume, one who had made connections in the medical world. He was able to charm his way into respected hospitals, his reputation initially bolstered by his degree and his natural charisma. The hospitals, too quick to give him the benefit of the doubt, failed to dig deeper into the complaints about his surgeries. They allowed him to continue operating, even as the number of victims grew. The turning point came when Dr. Moore and others began to realize the full scale of what had happened. The truth was undeniable. Duntsch had been given too many opportunities to practice. He had been trusted when he clearly wasn't capable of handling the responsibility. As the investigation intensified, so too did the pressure on the authorities. They began connecting the dots between all the botched surgeries, the malpractice complaints, and the rising body count. But even then, the question remained. Could Dr. Duntsch be stopped before more lives were lost? The courts were next. After months of mounting pressure, victims and their families finally had their day in court. But even then, the battle was far from over. Dr. Duntsch, still unrepentant, stood firm. He denied any wrongdoing, claiming that his surgeries had been misunderstood, that the complications were inevitable in his field of work. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his defense would soon begin to crumble. But the real question wasn't whether he would be convicted. It was why it had taken so long for anyone to intervene. Why had the hospitals failed to act? Why had the medical board been so slow to revoke his license? And why did it take so long for those in power to finally step in and stop him? As the investigation moved forward, it became increasingly clear that Dr. Duntsch's crimes were not just medical. They were a failure of the system. The people in charge had allowed him to continue, and their failure to act had caused irreparable harm to so many lives. Now, as the case made its way through the legal system, the victims could only wait for the justice they so rightly deserved. The wheels of justice were finally turning, but for those whose lives had been shattered by Dr. Duntsch, the cost had already been paid. After years of devastation, Dr. Christopher Duntsch was finally facing justice. But for the victims, their families, and even the public, the truth had become almost too hard to swallow. What had happened in those operating rooms, the lives lost, the bodies destroyed, could never be undone. As the trial began, it became painfully clear. Dr. Duntsch was not just an incompetent surgeon. He was something far more dangerous. A man who had taken an oath to heal, but instead became a harbinger of pain and death. The trial was a long-awaited moment of reckoning. The victims, who had once been ignored or dismissed, finally had a chance to make their voices heard. They were no longer just statistics in a medical report. They were real people, mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, people whose lives had been torn apart by one man's decisions. One by one, they took the stand, each of them carrying their own personal nightmare, a reminder of the man who had promised to help them, but instead had left them broken. There was the wife, sobbing as she recounted the moment she found out her husband would never walk again. He had gone in for a simple procedure, a routine back surgery, but when he woke up, he couldn't move. Doctors later confirmed that his spine had been severed during the operation. His life, and the life of his family, was irrevocably altered in that operating room. Then came the mother, her voice trembling as she spoke of her son, once an active young man, now reduced to a shadow of himself after a disastrous surgery. The damage done to his nerves was so severe that he was left in constant pain. She didn't even know how to explain to her child why he would never be the same again. And of course, there were the experts. Doctors who had worked alongside Duntsch, who had witnessed his alarming behavior and his repeated failures in the operating room. They testified to the sheer recklessness of his actions, describing how, in surgery after surgery, he had failed to adhere to even the most basic principles of neurosurgery. The horror didn't end with a single botched procedure. It was a continuous pattern of mistakes, some of which were so egregious that they defied any rational explanation. But despite the mounting evidence, despite the testimonies that painted a damning picture of a man who had destroyed so many lives, Dr. Duntsch remained unrepentant. He sat in court, seemingly detached, almost cold, as his victims shared their stories. There was no apology, no admission of guilt, only the same arrogance that had characterized his medical career. His demeanor in court was chilling, as though he had never truly grasped the weight of his actions, as though the lives he had ruined were nothing more than a series of unfortunate incidents. The trial stretched on for weeks, and with each passing day, the evidence became harder to ignore. Medical records were read aloud. Testimonies from victims and their families were delivered with raw emotion, and expert witnesses laid out the catastrophic effects of Duntsch's surgeries. Yet, through it all, Duntsch maintained that he was not a criminal. He continued to claim that his surgeries had simply gone wrong through no fault of his own. The idea that he was anything more than a well-meaning surgeon who made a few bad calls seemed to linger in the air, but it was increasingly difficult to believe. Then, the moment came that would forever define his fate: the jury's verdict. After hours of deliberation, the decision was made. Dr. Christopher Duntsch was found guilty of multiple counts of aggravated assault and sentenced to life in prison. For the victims and their families, it was a moment of catharsis, a small measure of justice in the face of a pain that could never fully heal. But even as the gavel came down, there was still a lingering sense of disbelief. How had it all gone this far? How had a man like Duntsch, someone so clearly unfit to practice, been allowed to harm so many people before the system stepped in? For those who had been watching, there was no real sense of relief. Duntsch was in prison now, yes, but what about all the lives lost? What about the people who would never walk again, or those who would spend the rest of their days in chronic pain? The trial had exposed more than just negligence. It had revealed the darkness that can lurk behind a white coat. It had exposed a man who had played God, and in doing so, had shattered the lives of everyone who trusted him. The trial also exposed something more insidious: the failure of the system. The medical system had failed to protect these victims. Hospitals had ignored the warning signs, and medical boards had allowed Duntsch to continue practicing even after his incompetence was glaringly obvious. It wasn't just one man who was guilty. It was an entire system that had allowed this horror to unfold. As the trial concluded and Dr. Duntsch was led away in handcuffs, there was a sense of finality. The court had spoken, and Duntsch would pay for his crimes. But for the victims, the damage had already been done. They could never undo the surgeries that ruined their lives, never reverse the pain and suffering they had endured. And as for Dr. Duntsch, even behind bars, he would continue to be the face of a tragedy that should never have happened. A chilling reminder that even in the places where we go to heal, there are dangers lurking, waiting to strike. The case of Dr. Death left an indelible mark on the medical world. It shattered the very trust that patients place in their doctors. No longer could people walk into a hospital with the certainty that the person wielding the scalpel had their best interests at heart. Dr. Christopher Duntsch's reign of terror had exposed the horrifying vulnerabilities within the system that were supposed to protect us, the very system that was meant to save lives. It wasn't just the 38 victims whose lives he destroyed, but the ripple effect of his actions reverberated across the entire healthcare industry. For the victims, there was no closure. There could be no healing. Some of them would never walk again. Others would spend the rest of their days in unrelenting pain. The families were left grappling with the cruel, irreversible consequences of one man's carelessness. The surgeries that had promised a cure, a new beginning, turned into their worst nightmare. As time went on, their lives became consumed with the aftermath. The legal battles, the medical treatments, the haunting memories of their once healthy loved ones. In the wake of Dr. Duntsch's conviction, hospitals nationwide scrambled to update their protocols. They had to face the uncomfortable truth that they had failed to identify an incredibly dangerous surgeon before it was too late. This case revealed an epidemic of unchecked malpractice, the result of a culture that had allowed incompetence to flourish behind closed doors. Dr. Duntsch had been enabled by a system that failed to hold him accountable when the signs were clear. In this world of white coats and sterile rooms, the most basic question remained: how had this been allowed to happen? He wasn't just a doctor who made mistakes. He was a man who had systematically destroyed lives, all while hiding behind a veneer of medical credentials and charm. His negligence wasn't the result of inexperience. It was intentional, reckless, and cold-hearted. But how could someone entrusted with so much power and responsibility have gone so far without anyone stepping in to stop him? Experts in the field of medicine began speaking out, calling for greater oversight and stronger accountability in surgical practices. They warned that there were too many doctors out there who, like Duntsch, had been allowed to slip through the cracks. There was no universal standard to ensure that physicians were held to the highest possible standards. Duntsch's case became a terrifying reminder of what can happen when those in power are not held responsible for their actions. And more importantly, it was a painful reminder of the lives that had been destroyed as a result. Yet, even amidst the overwhelming grief and anger, there was a glimmer of hope. The tragedy of Dr. Duntsch had ignited a conversation about patient safety and accountability. It had forced hospitals, regulatory bodies, and the medical community to ask difficult questions, questions that had been long ignored. How many other DR deaths were out there, operating in the shadows of the system? How could such a travesty ever happen again? But despite the reforms and the promises of change, for the victims, the damage had already been done. They would never forget the pain and the loss. They would never forget the man who had taken everything from them while wearing a white coat and smiling with the confidence of a healer. As the case of Dr. Death faded from the headlines, the families continued to mourn. Their loved ones could not be restored, and the scars would never fully heal. But they fought on, not just for justice, but to ensure that others would not suffer the same fate. They wanted their stories to be a warning, a reminder of what can happen when we place blind trust in those who hold our lives in their hands. In the end, the story of Dr. Death was about much more than one man's criminal actions. It was about the fragility of trust, the importance of accountability, and the lengths people will go to in order to protect their loved ones. It was a testament to the human spirit, the resilience of those who survive, who refuse to be silenced, even when the world around them seems to have failed them. This is not just the story of a killer in disguise. It is the story of those who were wronged and those who fought for justice. It is the story of a broken system and the people who, despite everything, have found the strength to rebuild. It is a story of betrayal and survival, of loss and resilience. The case of Dr. Death serves as a brutal reminder. The Hippocratic Oath, first, do no harm, is not just a principle to be written on the wall of a hospital room. It is a solemn vow that, when broken, can destroy everything. Lives are shattered, trust is lost, and the damage left in its wake is immeasurable. As the trial of Dr. Christopher Duntsch ended, so did the saga of a man who had once seemed unstoppable. But for the victims, their families, and the millions of people who put their trust in the healthcare system, the aftermath would last a lifetime. The lessons learned from this tragedy would continue to shape the medical profession, hopefully in ways that would protect future generations from the horrors of what happened. But for those who lived through it, the haunting truth remained. No amount of justice could ever undo the damage caused by one man's betrayal. The story of Dr. Death, in all its horror, is a story of how far a system can fall when it fails to protect those who need it most. And for the victims, it's a story of survival. A survival not just of the body, but of the soul. If this chilling story of betrayal and devastation has left an impact on you, don't let it fade away. Like, subscribe, and share this video with others who need to hear the truth behind Dr. Death's reign of terror. Join the conversation and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What are your feelings on the flaws in our medical system? And how can we ensure something like this never happens again? We want to hear your voice. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an eye-opening story from our channel.